So going right along with the notes that we did on graphing, you're going to be doing a graphing activity. Now this first page that you will have in the packet that I give you is basically notes. I want you to take this very front page off, put it in your notebook, in your notes section, and treat it as notes, okay? So we've already talked about why graphing is important. What I want you to focus on is the parts of a graph. These 5 things have to be on every graph you create if you want to get full credit for your work. You've got to have a title, okay? You have to have the independent variable and the dependent variable. We're going to talk more about that. You have to have the scales. We will definitely talk about that. And you've got to have a legend or a key, okay? Now the title is going to tell you what that graph is about. Y'all, this is science. We don't do cutesy little titles, okay? It's a straightforward title. What is that graph? If you're graphing how tall plants grow over time, you don't say, plants get big, all right? You need to say, how tall plants grow over time. Really straightforward and boring. That's what science is about, is letting people know what you're talking about with no room for guessing, okay? So the title is going to tell you exactly what the graph is about. It is always written up at the top, okay? Got to write it at the top. The independent variable is the variable that can be controlled by the experimenter, okay? When you are doing an experiment, you make the choice, or in a class, your teacher's going to tell you what you're experimenting on and how you're doing it, of what you're experimenting on. If I'm looking at how tall plants grow over time, I cannot control how big plants get, okay? The plant controls that. The soil, the nutrients, things like that. But I can decide how often I'm measuring the plant. That's what I'm controlling. I'm controlling that I'm going to measure the height every week. All right? So that's what I'm controlling. So it includes things like time, how often, depth, how deep am I looking, things like temperature, am I going to make it 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, okay? And that's going to be put on the x-axis. The x-axis is the horizontal axis, the one like this, okay? So the independent variable is the one that the person setting up the experiment chooses to look at, okay? The dependent variable is what happens because of that. It is the variable that is affected by the independent variable, all right? So how tall the plant is depends on when I measure it. If I measure it on Monday this week, I need to measure it again on Monday of next week, and it should have grown. But how much it grew depends on when I measure it. So it depends on the independent variable, okay? So it's what happens because of the independent variable. So if we were talking about oxygen bubbles produced by a plant, okay, the oxygen bubbles are dependent on how deep I decide to measure the plant, okay? And that's going to be put on the y-axis. The y-axis is the one that goes up and down, vertical, okay? When you are doing this, you have to create a scale. You know, the scale is very important. You can't just stick numbers on your x-axis and your y-axis. It needs to be in intervals, okay? You have to look at what your numbers are and then decide what the intervals are going to be. You can't go in there and put, okay, 2 feet, 3 feet, 7 feet, 9 feet, 21 feet, okay? It has to be set in intervals, okay? So for example, you can count by twos, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Or you can count by fives, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Or you could count by 50s, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. You just decide based on how big your numbers are, what interval you need to use. The other thing that you're doing with this scale is you have to use the same number of spaces. Remember, on graph paper, you have your little boxes. And each of those little boxes, okay, the lines represent numbers. Well, if you put a 2 on this line and then skip 1 and put a 4 on the next one and skip 1 and put a 6 on the next one, you can't all of a sudden go, ooh, not enough room. 8, 10, 12. If you start out skipping, you got to continue to skip. All right, so you got to really work with your numbers, look at how big your numbers are, decide what interval you need to use, and then decide where those numbers go on the lines. It's really, really important, okay? So those are going to dictate your values. And then you have to have a legend. If you're making a double bar graph or a double line graph or a triple bar graph or a triple line graph, you got to tell me what each line is. So you got to have a key. All right, quick reminder, mean, median, mode. Okay, you learned these last year. Miss Barsby taught you that crazy song. Please do not sing it to me. All right, but that song taught you about mean, median, and mode. Okay, you're going to be using mean, median, and mode to analyze your data. Okay, remember that the mean is basically an average. Add up all your numbers, divide by the number of digits you have. The median is the one that's in the middle. All right. For example, if you have an even number of values, you have to add the two together, 4 plus 5, and divide by 2. All right. But if you have an odd number, it's literally the one in the middle. And remember to always put your numbers in order from smallest to biggest to get your median. Don't forget that. And then the mode is the number that shows up the most often. Okay? So if your list was 2, 5, 8, 2, 6, 11, the number 2 is your mode because it's the only one that shows up twice. If you have several numbers that show up the same number of times, or if none of your numbers show up more than once, you have no mode. You literally have to write the words no mode or none. All right. A couple of things about constructing your graph. Always use as much of the graph paper as you can. Okay, don't make a tiny little graph. Don't take a big piece of graph paper and put a little bitty graph in it. Spread it out. Make it as big as you can and still get everything written on the edges. Okay, so spread them out. If I give you a piece of notebook paper, a piece of printer paper that has a grid already drawn on it, use the edges. Do not come inside this grid and write numbers. Use the edges, okay? So, you would go out here to put your y-axis. You would go down here to put your x-axis. Your scales are outside the edges of the squares. Don't forget to give me your dependent variable and your independent variable. Don't forget to give me a title. Don't forget to give me a key or a legend. Right? And make sure you have an actual scale. All right? Now, if I tell you to use your own graph paper, you have to write the numbers in the graph, but I want you to get it as close to the edges as you can get it. All right? Don't come right up here and go, boop, boop, give me a little bitty graph right here. Don't do that. Go as far to the edges as you can and still have room to write your information. Again, don't forget to give me a title, a scale, and a scale. The independent variable, what is it? The dependent variable, which is not on this picture, sorry. What is it? And don't forget, if there's more than one line or one bar, give me a legend like this. Okay, don't forget that. All right? And so your work now is going to actually be to create some graphs out of data and then answer answer some questions about that data. All right, the first graph, I'm going to give you a piece of graph paper. Woo, sorry, went too far. Okay, I'm going to give it to you. The second one, you're going to be doing it on your own graph paper. So here's that graph. Let me get there. See how I did it? Remember, this one, you're going to go out here to write your y-axis, your dependent variable. And you're going to go down here to write your x-axis, your independent variable. Okay? And then the second one, you've got to create in your own graph paper. All right, so good luck, and ask me questions if you have them.